Welcome back to the Religious Studies Podcast. Got something a little different for you today. It's a bonus episode, and get this, it's AI generated.
Yep, that's right.
But before you hit that skip button, rest assured, everything we'll be exploring has been carefully vetted by the mastermind himself, Bastian Friedborg.
Absolutely. You could say this episode has Bastian's official stamp of approval. We're diving deep into his master's thesis. And it's a topic I know our listeners will find fascinating. It looks at how Christianity actually influenced German migration policy during the 2015-2016 refugee
Oh,
crisis.
wow, yeah. Okay, you've got my attention already. We've discussed this period on the podcast before, of course. But to look at it through this particular lens, the intersection of religion and politics, especially during such a pivotal event, well, that's going to be really insightful.
You hit the nail on the head. We often hear about the political and economic fallout of the refugee crisis, right?
Right.
But Bastian's work goes deeper into this less explored territory, this religious influence.
Yeah.
Adds a whole new dimension to our understanding, I think.
And let's not forget the sheer scale of what was happening back then. I mean, we're talking about millions upon millions of people displaced, fleeing Syria and other conflict zones.
Yeah.
And Germany, with Angela Merkel at the helm, made this, well, some would say bold decision to welcome significant number of those refugees.
Yeah, and that's exactly what makes Bastian's research so compelling. His thesis dives right into the central question. What role did Christianity play in shaping not just public opinion, but also government policy on migration during this incredibly tumultuous period?
So to really grasp that, let's rewind the clock a bit. Set the stage, shall we?
Sounds good.
Think back to the Arab Spring uprisings in 2010, which ultimately triggered this chain reaction leading to the Syrian civil war. The scale of displacement was staggering, millions fleeing to neighboring countries, desperate for safety.
And Germany's response during this crisis, it really stood out. Merkel's government adopted what many called a welcoming culture, a policy that, frankly, contrasted sharply with the more cautious, let's say, approaches of many other European nations.
I bet some of our listeners right now are thinking, hold on, isn't Germany a largely secular country? How could religion have such a significant impact on policy? And that's where it gets really intriguing.
It does. Bastian's research really reveals this fascinating tension within German society, specifically within the Christian community. He explores these two contrasting interpretations of Christianity that were, well, you could say, battling it out during this period.
Okay, now I'm all ears. Tell me more about these two interpretations.
Sure. So on the one hand, you've got what Bastian calls the Good Samaritan approach. This emphasizes compassion, inclusivity, providing aid to those in need, regardless of background. It really aligns with the message Pope Francis was championing at the time.
That makes a lot of sense. It's
Yeah.
that classic image of helping your neighbor, offering a hand to those less fortunate. It feels, very much in line with those core teachings of Christianity.
Exactly. But, and here's where it gets interesting, on the other side of the spectrum, we have what Bastian terms the protective Christianity approach. This interpretation focuses on defending a national identity that's perceived as under threat. And it's often intertwined with anxieties about Islam, the potential for cultural change.
So on one side, you have this focus on universal compassion, and on the other, a concern with preserving a specific cultural and religious identity. That's a pretty stark contrast.
It is, and it raises a crucial question. How can one religion be used to justify such, well, diametrically opposed positions? And why did this tension erupt so forcefully in Germany during this particular crisis?
I can't wait to dig into the evidence and see how these competing interpretations played out in real-world policies and public discourse.
Well, to understand that, Bastian, he really goes deep. Public opinion polls, political speeches, you name it, government policies, he paints a nuanced picture of what was happening on the ground.
So what did he find? Did public opinion reflect these two contrasting views?
Absolutely. Initially, there was an outpouring of support for refugees in Germany. It was really fueled by that Good Samaritan impulse, helping those fleeing war and persecution. In fact, it's estimated that something like 88% of Germans donated to refugee causes at the peak of the crisis.
Wow, that's incredible. It sounds like there was a genuine sense of compassion, a willingness to open their doors to those in need.
There was. But, and it's important to remember this, public opinion, it's rarely static, especially when you're dealing with such a complex and evolving situation.
You mean as the crisis went on, public opinion began to shift?
Exactly. As the number of refugees increased and certain anxieties, about cultural differences, those started to take root. public opinion became more fractured. A pivotal moment that really accelerated this shift was, you might remember, the series of assaults that took place in Cologne on New Year's Eve 2015.
Ah, yes, I remember that. That event really shook the nation. It fueled anxieties about security and the integration of refugees.
It did. The idea of a clash of civilizations, it gained traction. And those anxieties, especially about integrating Muslim refugees, well, those intensified. It's important to note, though, that public opinion wasn't monolithic. There were still many Germans who continued to support Merkel's open-door policy, even amidst these anxieties.
It's a good reminder that we're talking about a complex society with a diverse range of viewpoints, right? It's not as simple as Germany was welcoming or Germany was against refugees.
Exactly. And to fully grasp the complexity, I think we need to zoom in a bit, focus on Angela Merkel and the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, her political party. Remember, the CDU has deep Christian roots. Those naturally played a role in shaping their approach to this crisis.
Okay, so Merkel and her party were caught in the middle of this societal tug-of-war, compassion versus protection. How did that play out within the CDU? Did they fall neatly on one side or the other?
Now that's where it gets even more interesting. Merkel herself, she took a strong moral stance. She grounded her open-door policy in those Christian values of compassion, offering aid to the vulnerable. She even invoked the Good Samaritan parable to justify her position.
So she was very much aligning herself with that Good Samaritan approach.
Yes, but it wasn't quite that simple. There was a definite internal struggle within the CDU. They were trying to balance those humanitarian ideals with, growing public anxieties and pressure from the CSU, their more conservative Bavarian sister party.
The CSU. They tend to be more, well, let's just say protective of traditional Bavarian values. So how did this internal debate within the CDU unfold? Were there specific policy clashes or arguments that reflected these two competing interpretations of Christianity?
Absolutely, and that's precisely where we'll pick up in our next segment. We'll delve into how these religious and political forces translated into concrete action, focusing on the policies enacted by a key agency, the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, or FAMF.
Okay, so we've got Merkel trying to juggle these competing Christian ideals within her own party, all while navigating, a public opinion that's shifting under her feet. And smack dab in the middle of all this is BAM, the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees. I mean, talk about pressure.
Yeah.
They were the ones actually handling those asylum claims. I can only imagine they were under immense pressure to get it right, whatever that meant at the time.
Oh, absolutely. BAM was right there in the hot seat, making these life-altering decisions. Who gets asylum, who doesn't. And it's fascinating, really, to see how their policies, how they actually mirrored those very tensions we've been talking about.
Okay, I'm sensing a but coming. They started out with that welcoming culture approach, but then things changed.
Exactly. At first, BAM was focused on welcoming refugees, providing support. It reflected that initial national sentiment. But then, as the sheer numbers just kept rising, public anxiety grew, and we start to see a pretty distinct shift in their approach.
So towards a more restrictive, maybe even a bit defensive stance.
Right. Bastian highlights a few key policy changes that really exemplify this shift. One example is the introduction of what they called a list of safe countries of origin.
Safe countries.
Yeah. Basically, this meant that if you were fleeing, let's say, from one of those countries, mostly Balkan nations, well, you faced a much tougher road to get asylum.
So someone is escaping conflict in, say, Albania, they were less likely to be granted asylum compared to someone from Syria.
That's right. And the logic behind it was to streamline the process, deter those who might be seeking economic opportunities rather than, genuine safety. And, of course, manage that sheer volume of applications. But, of course, it also had some unintended consequences.
The domino effect. Germany tries to control the influx, but it potentially burdens other nations with processing asylum claims, even if those countries might not be equipped to handle it.
Exactly. It raises these big questions like, how do we even define a safe country, especially in a world where things can change so quickly? And it also brings us back to those two competing interpretations of Christianity.
Okay, I'm ready for the connection. How does the safe country policy tie back to those Good Samaritan versus protective Christianity ideas?
Well, think about it. Those who are pushing for stricter controls, prioritizing national identity, they might argue that, look, we need to prioritize resources for those who are, let's say, more deserving, maybe those fleeing war-torn regions, and that this is a way to protect German citizens and their way of life.
So they're essentially saying, We can be compassionate, but we also have a duty to protect our own.
Exactly. It's a complex balancing act. And of course, those who are advocating for a more open, inclusive approach, they might counter that, turning away those from safe countries ignores the fact that those countries might not be safe for everyone. Think religious minorities, those facing persecution. It's not always that
A
simple.
real moral and ethical dilemma. And I can see how both sides could find justification within their own interpretations of Christian values. What other policy shifts did BAMF implement that reflected this tension?
Another significant change was the tightening of deportation rules. This happened after the Cologne assaults. There was a huge public push to make it easier to deport individuals who committed crimes, especially, well, refugees, migrants.
Understandably so. Those events really amplified anxieties about security and integration. But how did this affect the asylum process itself?
Well, it added another layer of complexity. Before the changes, even if someone was denied asylum, deportation wasn't always straightforward,
Yeah.
especially for those from conflict zones where they might face real danger if they returned.
Right. Germany's commitment to human rights meant they couldn't just, send people back into harm's way.
Yeah.
So how did they reconcile these competing pressures?
It became a real tightrope walk. You had the desire to uphold humanitarian principles, but on the other hand, you had this mounting public pressure to, prioritize security and manage the number of refugees within Germany.
So how did this play out in practice? Did Bastian's research offer any specific examples?
He did. He cites cases of individuals, those from safe countries, who were suspected of entering Germany, well, mainly for economic reasons. And the new rules allowed BAM to basically fast-track those cases, and if their claims of persecution didn't hold up, deport them more quickly.
So the burden of proof, it shifted dramatically. It wasn't enough to just say you were fleeing a tough situation. You had to have solid evidence to back up your claim.
Exactly. And this had a profound impact on the asylum process, especially for those who maybe didn't speak German, didn't understand the legal system, didn't have access to a lawyer. It's complicated.
It sounds like a really daunting process to navigate, especially for someone who's already traumatized, disoriented from fleeing their home country.
Absolutely. And that's a key point Bastian makes. He argues that while these policy changes, they were intended to manage the crisis, alleviate public concerns, they also had these unintended consequences for the very people they were designed to protect.
It's a classic case, I think, of the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing. And it highlights, how important it is to have policies that address those immediate concerns, but also, consider the long-term well-being of everyone affected.
Couldn't agree more. And there's another layer to this, which Bastian explores in his thesis. He delves into the financial support system for refugees, which also went through some big changes during this period.
You mean the benefits they received to cover basic needs?
Yes. Additionally, refugees received these non-cash benefits while they were living in those reception centers. Things like food, clothing, shelter.
Makes sense. It ensures their basic needs are met while they're in that transitional phase.
Yeah.
But did this change?
It did. As things progressed, there was this push to move toward a cash-based system, so refugees received, a set amount of money each month.
I can see the logic there. It gives individuals more autonomy, choice, in how they manage their own finances. But were there any downsides to this approach?
There were definitely concerns. Some argued that a cash-based system, well, it could lead to exploitation, mismanagement of funds, especially for those who were new to the German financial system or maybe vulnerable to scams.
That's a valid concern. It underscores, how important it is to have those financial literacy resources, those support services to help refugees navigate a new system.
Did Bastian's research touch on any other aspects of daily life?
He did. He looked into the integration programs offered to refugees. These programs designed to help them, learn German, find work, become part of German society.
Those programs are so vital, they can really make or break the integration process. What did Bastian learn about them?
Well, he discovered that while these programs existed, they were often stretched thin, lacking adequate funding. The sheer number of refugees, it just overwhelmed the existing systems, the resources.
It's a recurring theme, isn't it? This crisis was of such magnitude that it really tested the limits of even Germany's, robust social safety net. Precisely. Bastian noted things like long wait times for language courses, limited job training opportunities, and just the general complexities of German bureaucracy as common hurdles that refugees faced in trying to integrate.
So even with good intentions, the reality on the ground was that many refugees faced significant obstacles in rebuilding their lives.
Exactly. And it highlights the need for sustained investment in integration programs even after, that initial wave of a crisis subsides. Integration, it's a long-term process. It demands continued commitment, resources. But, there were also some positive aspects of Germany's response.
Okay, I'd love to hear about those bright spots. What worked well? What can we learn from those successes?
Bastian actually highlighted one program called Getting to Work Jobs for Mothers with Migration Backgrounds.
That sounds promising. What was the goal of that program?
It specifically addressed the challenges faced by mothers with migration backgrounds in, well, entering the German workforce.
I can see how that would be immensely helpful. Mothers often face those extra hurdles, childcare, cultural expectations, things that could make finding employment that much more challenging.
Exactly. And this program aimed to provide that targeted support, training, resources to help these women overcome those obstacles and, achieve financial independence.
It's encouraging to hear about initiatives like this. It's a reminder that within this large-scale crisis, there were also individual stories of resilience, determination, and success. Did Bastian highlight any other positive initiatives?
He did. He mentioned the German Islam Conference, or DI, which was established back in 2006. This initiative acted as a dialogue platform between the German government and Muslim communities within Germany.
That sounds like a valuable forum, a place to address concerns, build bridges, foster understanding. What were some of the key topics they discussed?
The DIK focused on a range of issues, from the integration of Islam into German religious law to the participation of Muslims in, German society and democracy, and of course, the prevention of extremism, radicalization.
All critical areas for dialogue and collaboration. It sounds like a proactive approach to making sure that Muslim communities feel included, valued.
Precisely. And Bastian's research suggests that these types of initiatives, while maybe less prominent than, big policy changes, they still played a vital role in shaping the integration process.
It's a reminder that beyond those government policies, the bureaucratic procedures, there were also those grassroots efforts, community organizations, individuals, tirelessly working to support refugees and cultivate understanding.
Absolutely. And that's a really important part of the story. It often gets overshadowed by those big headlines, but it's those acts of kindness, compassion, and human connection that can really make a difference in such challenging times.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the evolution of BAM policies to those day-to-day experiences of refugees to the integration initiatives, both the successful ones and those that face some pretty big challenges. It's clear that Germany's response to this crisis was, well, multifaceted with both triumphs and tribulations.
Yes, and Bastian's thesis gives us this incredibly valuable window into, I think, the complexity of this moment in history. It's a reminder that there are always multiple perspectives to consider, even within what might seem like, a pretty straightforward policy decision.
A call for nuance, to see the human stories behind the statistics, recognize the lasting impact of these events. And speaking of lasting impacts, that brings us to our final segment, where we'll explore some of the broader implications of this period. And I'll leave you with some thought-provoking questions to ponder. We've talked about those immediate impacts, on policy and daily life. But what about the long-term ripples? What kind of lasting effects did this period have not just on Germany, but on Europe as a whole?
That's where Bastian's thesis really gets us thinking, beyond the headlines. He argues that this whole crisis forced Germany to confront, well, some pretty fundamental questions about its national identity.
We touched on this earlier, right? That idea that Germany didn't, at least traditionally, see itself as a country of immigrants. That perception was definitely challenged, to say the least, when over 1 million refugees, many from very different cultures, arrived.
Yeah, exactly. And that sparked these really intense debates about what it even means to be German. How much cultural diversity can a society absorb? How do you balance, those humanitarian impulses with concerns about, well, preserving a national identity?
It sounds like a delicate balancing act. You want to be welcoming, compassionate, but also not lose sight of what, makes your nation unique.
Right. And that tension was palpable throughout this whole period. Bastian points out that the rise of those anti-immigration sentiments, groups like Pegida, the AfD, that was a direct response to this, the sense of threat, this threat to German identity.
It's a reminder that even in a country known for its tolerance and openness, those rapid demographic shifts, they can trigger some anxieties and fears.
For sure. And it wasn't just a German phenomenon either, you know. We saw similar trends across Europe as different nations grappled with, this influx of refugees and what it meant for their own sense of national identity.
So this crisis really had ripple effects far beyond Germany's borders. It was a defining moment, really, for Europe as a whole.
Definitely. It really tested that idea, that concept of European solidarity,
Right.
forced nations to kind of confront, well, their shared values, their responsibilities.
We saw it play out in those debates over refugee quotas, border control, the future of the Schengen Agreement. This crisis exposed some deep divisions within the EU.
And those divisions, they haven't just vanished, they're still shaping European politics, policies to this day.
What Bastian's thesis really highlights for me is that this isn't just some historical event we can, neatly categorize and put away. It's an ongoing process with long-term consequences that we're still grappling with.
It is, and it raises all sorts of questions that are, well, frankly, tough to answer. For instance, has that welcoming culture that Germany embraced initially, has it faded away? Or can it be revived?
That's a big one. Has Germany learned from this experience? Or has it become more cautious, even more restrictive in its approach to migration?
And what about the refugees themselves? How has this whole experience shaped their own identities, their sense of belonging?
Have they successfully integrated into German society? Or do they still face, marginalization, discrimination? These are questions that are still challenging researchers, policymakers, all of us.
Another key question that comes up is how this crisis has impacted, that relationship between religion and politics in Germany. Has it strengthened the role of religion in public life, or has it pushed it further to the margins?
It's a complex issue, no easy answers. But Bastian's thesis, it gives us a valuable starting point for those discussions. A reminder that religious ideas, they often underpin our responses to these major global events, even when we don't realize it.
And that's what's so great about a deep dive like this. It doesn't just, give us answers. It sparks more questions, encourages critical thinking, challenges us to see things from new perspectives.
It leaves us with this sense of intellectual curiosity, a desire to dig deeper, to learn more. And that, to me, is the hallmark of truly engaging scholarship.
So if you're intrigued by these questions, want to explore Bastian's work further, we'll include a link to his full thesis in the show notes. Definitely check it out.
And that wraps up our deep dive into Bastian Freiburg's thesis on Christianity and German migration policy. We hope this episode has given you a new lens, a new way to view this complex and fascinating moment in history.
Remember, even in a world of, quick takes, instant analysis, it's always worth taking that time to, go deeper, understand the nuances, appreciate the power of ideas in shaping our world. Thanks for joining us on this journey.